I'll try and keep it most non-geologic, because I do realize that a lot of us out here are not from that background, so a lot of the things that I keep saying might just seem absolutely not in link. So when we talk about universal basic assets, we know that work and income have never had a very close relationship, especially now with the automation which is coming up, looming up ahead in a very, very big way. We know that very soon we will lose a lot more jobs. So it's all at stake. Food security is an issue. With the kind of climate change that we have, we are looking forward to we're not looking forward rather, we're rather moving forward to an era where we are going to have to face a lot of difficulties. So I'm going to talk about, very briefly, about certain things which have a basis in the geological properties of this planet. So earlier on, when we had that panel discussion, I had spoken about this. I had said that nature never really meant for us to be homogeneous. Right through the entire crust of the Earth, which is the outermost part of the Earth, of the planet, you have a lot of economic mineral deposits, as in minerals which can be extracted and in a very economically viable way. And such deposits are not in, they're not spread over evenly. There's a lot of unevenness in that. So therefore, we have a concept in geology which is known as mineral provinces, which means that minerals down the ages, the Earth is almost 4.9 to 5 billion years old, which is a lot of time. And in that entire geological time scale, minerals have not been formed right through. It has not been a continuous process. And that's the reason why we should be that much more concerned, because there are certain minerals which have formed at certain times, and there have not been the geological processes or the geological situations for those minerals to revive again, or rather have another set of formation, or rather another phase of formation for that matter. Like for instance, we are in Assam, we are talking about the seat of petroleum reserves in India. We have the petroleum in the rocks which are in a very specific rock strata in Assam and the surrounding states, like we have a little bit of oil in Tripura as well. And those strata, if they have been extracted, that's it. We don't have that oil anymore. And that kind of oil formation, as you know, which is a fossil fuel, would require a certain kind of situation for that oil to form, because a fossil fuel means that for that oil to form, there must have been some kind of a mass extinction at one point of time, where a whole lot of animal species must have died out at the same time. All got buried, all formed oil. Now that has to happen again. And for that to happen, you have to have those specific situations, geological specifications for that matter. So, like I said, natural resources form a very, very important part of universal basic assets. It is one of the basic parts. And then we have the fresh water, we have air, we have minerals, which should be a joint inheritance. But then for that, we have to have a very, very specific set of rules, a very specific set of government policies to be able to put all of that into the right perspective and not have the mafia take over, for that matter. So I just spoke about the concept of mineral provinces. I don't know if many of you may be unaware of the fact that, the Vietnam War, which was fought in the 1960s, we have a lot of information about it. We know why it was fought, how it was lost. We have all that, the details. But a lot of people are probably unaware of the fact that Vietnam happens to be one of the largest deposits of wollastonite, which is an ore for tungsten. And in the 1960s, that was the time when US had their entire budget meant for space travel. And you required tungsten in large quantities, because you required to make something called fatigue-free steel, which is a kind of steel which, if you make a spaceship with that, you are able to limit the kind of collapse, you know. Normal steel would probably collapse. You don't know if it goes, you put it out onto the space, it might just collapse. So in the 1960s, they had this requirement for large amounts of wollastonite. So what do? This is one of the very few places on the earth which has wollastonite deposits. So what they try to do is they try to wage a war and take over all of that. But of course, things kind of went a little awry. We will not get into such politically incorrect discussions right now, so let's just stick to the rocks. So what I'm trying to say is that that is what I was talking about, you know, the concept of mineral province. You don't have wollastonite anywhere else in the world. US is such a huge country, India is such a huge country, but we don't have that kind of tungsten deposits anywhere. So the mineral provinces are not infinite. Finite entities, which kind of can get over at any point in time. And so I just want to, show you these two maps. The one on the right, it is to do with the geological provinces. Now, what is a geological provinces? Province is basically a particular entity on the crust, which is made up of a particular kind of specific rock. So if you look at that map on the right, you see this green part, that is the Deccan Plateau, which is one of the world's largest igneous rock complex. And it is a volcanic complex. A small little tidbit, it's very interesting to note that India has one of the third largest igneous complexes in the world, and yet we don't have a single active volcano on the mainland, which is a very interesting fact. I mean, where did all that come from? And the Deccan Plateau is not more than 60 million years old, which is a very, very short period of time in terms of the geological time scale. So coming back to it, all those pink areas are really old rocks, which we call Archean and Proterozoic. And the light pink areas that you see are the youngest rocks, because if you are familiar with the geography of India, you will know that the light pink areas are all to do with the Indus, the Brahmaputra, and the Gangetic Plain. So that is very, very recent. Geologically speaking, it's like yesterday. It was formed yesterday. So if I try and see India's mineral wealth, you'll find that most of the metals and non-metal deposits that we have in our country, they are restricted to the dark pink areas, which means that most of those are restricted to rocks which are more than 1,200 million years old. We have a lot of that in Shillong Plateau as well. All of those who are from the northeast, you'll find it very interesting that in the entire northeastern region, everything else is, say, around 30 to 40 million years to recent, like as of yesterday. And Shillong Plateau is around 1,200 million years old. So that's another very interesting concept about the northeast. Stop me, because if I get into it, I'll just carry on talking about it. But anyway, coming back to what we were discussing, so what we see is that most of the metals and non-metals that we have in our country, which are economically viable, belong to rocks which are more than 1,200 million years old, which means that once those rocks and minerals are depleted, we are not going to get that back. So we need to be very, very careful about what we really do with our mining laws. This again is this is the extreme left-hand side is coal. The middle one is metallic minerals, and the extreme right is non-metallic minerals. Once again, you'll find that most of it is to do with very specific regions. Certain minerals are found in certain rocks, and that's it. Now, the next important or the next interesting, I'm not going to go into all of this because this is like, India's mineral wealth. Like I said, it's very specific, meant for specific rocks. Now, the interesting part about this is that, like I mentioned in the discussion we had earlier, that if you take the maps of the tribal populations in India, and we take a map of the forested areas, and we take a map of the mineral wealth, we find that they all have an overlap. And it's a very interesting overlap because it's where you have the forest, you have mineral wealth out there. And that's the reason why we have such a lot of problems with mining, the kind of mining laws we have, the kind of forestry laws we have, and all of that is overlapping. And so therefore for India to go forward, to move forward, and to have sustainable mineral wealth which can be turned into something like universal basic assets, we need to have very, very specific laws and in place. Now, I am a geologist. I am not really conversant so much with the mineral laws, and I'm a structural geologist, actually. I basically work with earthquakes. So that's the interesting part, because you are talking about a particular demographic section which is living in those forests. You're talking about wildlife which is there in the forest. You're talking about trees which are part of the forest, and you're also talking about minerals which are underneath the forest. So how do you extract it, or how do you formulate those laws so that the forests remain, the people don't get affected, the wildlife doesn't get affected, and yet you have enough money to put it forward as a universal basic asset? So that is something which I feel in a place like the forum that we have here for Balipara Foundation is the best place to kind of deliberate upon it or talk about it, because we have people from all sections of, or rather all different domains. And I think people can actually come up with the correct measures and at least come up with certain, directives, or so to say, which we can probably put it all together and present it to the right authorities. So this is an interesting fact that forests and mineral wealth and the tribal population, they are all in the same part of the crust. So how do we do that? I mean, how do we go about it? So I think I'll stop there, and I can answer a question if you have one. In fact, I think I'll just show you one more last slide. I think I'm taking up too much time, but I'll just show you one more last slide. This is the northeastern part of India, where you can see, that SP is Shillong Plateau. You have the Himalayas on the north. You have the Burmese mountains, which are along the southeast. And you have the Mishmi Hills, which are literally cross-cutting, or rather, they're literally, they're kind of, the Himalayas kind of get truncated against the Mishmi Hills, which is a very interesting part. It's one of the most, we talk about biodiversity in the Northeast, I can talk about geodiversity in a big way. I mean, this is one part in the entire crust of the earth where you have 4 tectonic plates at the same place at a very small area, like aerial expanse, and all of that is moving. All of those plates are moving. So you have the Tibetan plate, which is north of the Himalayas. You have the Burmese plate, which is southeast of that hill. You have the Indian plate, which is the green part, which has kind of moved in the middle. And you have the Chinese plate, which is on the northeast extreme. And there are 4 plates. They're all moving against each other. Can you imagine the kind of stress which must be building up in all these rocks? And the interesting part is that in all these kind of tectonic movements, we call it metallotectonism, which means wherever you have tectonic movements, that's where the crust actually grinds against each other, and that's where new minerals are formed. New minerals as in ore bodies are formed, which means that even as I speak, this entire area in the northeast must be forming a lot of new ore bodies. So therefore, a lot of research. I find it very, sometimes even frustrating that very often we do a lot of research, a lot of credible research. Everyone is doing research, but I think interdisciplinary kind of a research is what is the matter which should be addressed at this point in time, because that is where we will be able to come up with actual answers. Because otherwise, each one is doing research in a very, very, in their own fields, and they're coming up with their own issues, and they're coming up with their own conclusions, but none of those conclusions will actually be brought onto the ground. What Mr. Ranjit Thakur had said earlier on in the morning, that, here at Balipara Foundation, they look forward to this kind of an interdisciplinary kind of a discussion, because that's where the policy making becomes more easy, because everyone comes up with their own ideas, their own research, and all that put together, amalgamated, can actually come up with the problems that we are going to face, that we are facing, and that we will be facing in the future. So, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Sunayana.
Hi.
I'm Rupa Barua.
Yes, I know you.
wanted to ask you, you talk about the 4 tectonic plates that are moving against each other. Does that affect the Brahmaputra and the floods that we're having
yes,
today?
it does.
Yeah.
But what is very interesting is that there are these 4 tectonic plates which are moving against each other, which means that, that green part which I had shown, that part is what should have had maximum amount of stress build up. But the stress is along these huge faults that we have, which are basically the margins of the Shillong Plateau. So if you look at it historically, all the large earthquakes that we have had in the northeastern region, all of those epicenters have been along the boundaries of the Shillong Plateau. So you've had a Dhubri earthquake, you've had an earthquake which was along the Brahmaputra fault, which is, the Brahmaputra, it comes from Arunachal Pradesh, it comes in a southwesterly way, and then suddenly it goes east-west. If you have noticed. That's along a particular fault, which is the northern boundary of the Shillong Plateau. And then along the northwestern corner of the Shillong Plateau, it just takes a 90-degree turn, because it's following those faults. So the entire river system is bound by faults. The entire river system is controlled by the faults. And all of those earthquakes that we have had in this area are all related to faults around the Shillong Plateau. So that's very interesting. In fact, we have a lot of research going on. Very recently, you have the DST has this particular scheme which talks about landslide mitigation. So I have an ongoing project there where I'm studying the shear zones, basically the faults in the Shillong Plateau, and trying to come up with an earthquake cyclicity factor, where a particular kind of rock is formed every time there's an earthquake called pseudotachylite. And if you can find that pseudotachylite and you can date it, then you can have a timeline of large earthquakes that we have had. Because if you look at history, we do not have records of large earthquakes, say, before 1800. So with that, you'll be able to kind of stretch that earthquake timeline to, say, another 2,000 years, or even more for that matter. And once that happens, then we can find a cyclicity factor. So that gives us an understanding of prediction, like when will the large one come next. And also, most importantly, because of earthquake movements and earthquake plausibility in this area, you also have mineral formation. So if we can understand that, then probably we'll be able to understand where those minerals are. Like, so very, very often, minerals are formed along faults which go very deep. So if you can understand those faults, and if you can understand the geology of that place, you can actually predict that at what depth you'll find, say, maybe gold. So for all you know, Assam might be sitting on the world's largest gold deposit, and we don't know it because the research hasn't been so. That kind of a thing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes.
So with this, again, going back to the last slide that you showed, my interest in this is to find out that the work that you are doing, is there a scope of this kind of work feeding into the plans that the government makes either at the state level or at the center?
Or the central level.
And where the irrigation department is also very much
part of it.
Planning. For instance, in Arunachal Pradesh, about 140 large dams have been sanctioned.
Yes.
So if not today, tomorrow they are going to come. So 80 of them were sanctioned when the Congress were there, and now the remaining have been sanctioned when BJP. So now when you talk of Northeast as being sitting on a time bomb, because you have 4 plates,
yes,
and it is seismically very, very sensitive, that kind of information, doesn't this feed into something like that? Because you're creating miniature bombs out there.
Exactly, because if there's a large dam and if there's an earthquake, large earthquake.
No, but so that how can 140 dams get sanctioned when some work is happening at this level? Because
So that's exactly what I said, that very often the research remains at research level. Now, I don't know whether, see, for instance, when I was in IIT, Bombay, where, and I was doing my PhD and my postdoc, and that point of time, we had a kind of it was an integration kind of a project, where we were trying to look at possibility of earthquake in the Deccan Plateau. Now see, we all know that Deccan Plateau is aseismic. There are no earthquakes as such. And the only earthquakes that we have had in the recent years is because of the Koyna Dam. And that's a very, very man-made thing. Yeah, it's a very man-made thing because the reservoir was built on a particular rock which did not have the strength to, take. It didn't have that, it couldn't take the strength of that amount of impounding of water. And that's the reason why we had that 13th December, I think 1956, if I can't remember the date, where there was a large earthquake. So now these kind of earthquakes are absolutely going to happen in Arunachal Pradesh because if these dams come up. So I really don't know because GSI has all the data. It's a government body. The researchers are doing their bit. They have all the... In fact, you'll be surprised to know that most of the people who are working in the Northeast on earthquake studies are people from outside India.
but I think, are you guys, even the researchers involved, allowed to talk in public about these
We are
things?
not.
That's what I'm saying.
See, because I have that DST project, I'm not allowed to talk about my data anywhere. So I guess...
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.